I'm using, it works. Okay, good. Morning. This is Nationalism Returns to America. I'm Alan Rudy, moderator. Wednesday, April 12th, session 3311. We will be over at 12:20. May run over a little bit because I don't think there's another session planned for this room immediately. A couple of business things. Would everyone who has downloaded the app raise your hand? Wow, good. For those who haven't, the app will add value to your conference experience. It's really pretty wonderful, and it's really easy to download. Go to your app store, put in Conference on World Affairs, and then let it come down and follow directions. It will enable you to ask questions quickly. As a matter of fact, questions can be submitted 1 hour before the session starts. You can grade the session on the app, and it makes things work a whole lot better for you. And then I have, before we really get started, I wanted to talk about the fact that everybody in here knows that the Conference on World Affairs is free and open to the public. But it's not cost-free. It costs in excess of $600,000 to produce the 200-plus sessions, transport participants, print programs, and pay the staff that puts all this together. You also know, I'm sure, that the conference is a joint venture between the city, between us, the community, and the university. That means that if we really enjoy this and feel it's important and want to see it continue and prosper, we really need to contribute to its support. We get about 70,000 butts and seats over the course of the conference for the whole week. If you could allocate out of your annual giving just a little bit, $1, $2, $3 a session, well, 3 times 70,000 adds up pretty quick, goes a long way, and it would make us an additional part of the conference. We would have ownership in a way that we don't have now. You can do that. You can make your contribution by using the app, by going onto the website, or that you can pick up an envelope on your way out of the hall. Is there, where is Delmar? Where are you? I don't see him right now, but there will be somebody at the door to assist you. Now, questions, and for those of you who have been to sessions before this would know, the questions can be submitted on the app, or should you not have the app, cards will be distributed. If you raise your hand, you'll get a card. You can send it up here, and we will take your question. I see microphones over here. They will not be used for questions. Okay. By the way, I've been moderating panels here for about 15 years, and I've never moderated or attended a panel with more qualified panelists to address a subject than the one we have today. I'm really looking forward to it. Our panelists are, we'll do it this way. Sitting to my right is Dr. Steve Verdevac. Excuse me, Steve Verdevac. He's a CU alum. He has fellowships at 6 universities, is a consultant to 9 agencies, and he fulfills those obligations to universities and agencies by sharing his expertise in the field of religious and ethnic diversity, ethnic diasporas, International Migration and Transnational Anthropology. If we had written a job description for somebody for this panel, he would be way up on the list. Next to him is Mike Frank. Mike has been coming, how many years have you been here?
Like 14.
Whoa, 14 years. He served at a very senior level of Republican strategy, thought, and political support. His task today is to clarify us today's Republican platform and its implications for our new sense of nationalism. Mauricio Jerry. By the way, for those who may have looked him up on Google, I don't think that he's a Mauricio Jerry who performs music inspired by Alsatian gypsy tradition. There is another one. Ours is the one with expertise in democracy, human relations, and conflict resolutions in Latin America, Middle East, and Southeastern Asia. He can provide us with a comparison of America's current form of nationalism and that of countries that are the center of his professional experience. As you probably know, each speaker will talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll have them talk to each other for a couple of 3 minutes, and then we'll ask questions. Steve, do you want to go first?
Hi, good morning. This is going to be difficult because I talk with my hands, maybe not as much as Mauricio, but I'll give it a go. So good morning. Thanks for being here on a beautiful day. It's hard to be inside, but we'll hopefully give you much to think about. I'm going first in this panel because I'm going to take, let's say, the broadest brush approach. I'm going to take a global comparative perspective on this question of nationalism returning to America. And let me just first say something about where I'm coming from, literally and figuratively, because that informs what I'm going to talk about and say. So I grew up in Chicago and then came to CU as a student. I've probably got my alumnus ribbon. But really, over the past 35 years, I've lived in Europe. So I'm an expat American looking back on developments over the years in my country. So I think that's an important thing to say first. Yeah, I'm viewing developments from afar. Another thing is that of those 35 years I've spent outside of the US, 25 years of those were in the United Kingdom. I was a professor at Oxford for a number of years and so forth. And during that time, I took out British citizenship. Okay, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it wasn't because I particularly wanted to swear allegiance to the Queen or something. I had to do that, kind of stuck in my throat. But it was mainly because I was sick of standing in line at Heathrow every time I went in and out. But also just for things like work permit and taxes and so forth, it was a thing to do. So the upshot of that was last year I voted in the Brexit referendum. And then shortly after that, I also voted in the American presidential election. And yeah, I got burned twice, badly. It was a real kind of 1-2 punch. So that informs some of my views. Now I live in Germany, and I also vote there, but just in local elections. But maybe that's how much I love democracy, is I vote wherever I go. But there I run quite a large research institute, over 100 people looking globally and comparatively at issues of diversity, nationalism, immigration, and so forth. So both in this professional and kind of personalized sense, I come to the sort of issues that I want to talk about. And so first with this kind of global perspective, I mean, I think it's quite clear for people who pay attention to international news and so forth that really over the past 10 years or so, we've seen a global rise in various kinds of nationalism. India, Russia, Turkey, Hungary, England, France, we see a lot of nationalisms being presented to us. And the thing that I want to kind of focus on in my brief comments is first what those things have in common, the types of discourse or rhetorics in these different global nationalisms. And one thing they all have in common is each nationalist leader lays claim to the people. And of course, how they're defining the people, in each case, is, we could say, just a segment of the population that they are addressing as the people that they represent. So in France, we've got Marine Le Pen right now. Her, she's running for the presidency. Her slogan is au nom du peuple, in the name of the people. But you look at all of her discourse, it's about French Catholics. And by way of talking about French Muslims, she doesn't address them as co-citizens, she addresses them as an occupying force. In Turkey, which Maurizio knows a lot more about, Tayyip Erdogan, following the coup, ushered in a state of emergency in the name of the people. And those people were, of course, his supporters. And this ushering in a state of emergency in the name of the people, of course, has allowed him to seize more and more power. In the UK, Nigel Farage, the day after the Brexit vote, claimed that this was a victory for real people. And you remember that the Brexit vote was 52% in favor. So if those are the real people, what are the 48%? Likewise, this kind of rhetoric of addressing the people in exclusivist terms. The Daily Mail, which is a kind of unabashedly right-wing national newspaper in the UK, the day after the High Court in the UK basically said that Parliament has to discuss Brexit. It wasn't saying we're not going to do Brexit. The High Court just says Parliament has to discuss it first before Article 50 can be triggered. The Daily Mail on the day afterwards had pictures of 3 High Court judges, and it said, enemies of the people. So we see the same sort of thing picked up by Donald Trump, who in February 17, in his Twitter, called the national news media in the US enemies of the American people. I'm thinking, well, aren't the media American people too? But you're getting my point. Exclusivist takes on saying they represent the people. In May 16, Donald Trump said, the only real thing is the unification of the people because the other people don't mean anything. And finally, example, at his inauguration, he said, January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. And again, a large part of the population, are they the same people he's talking about? I don't know. So in each case, you see what I mean. People in certain kinds of nationalisms laying claim to the people, but a very exclusive segment of the people, and claiming that those are, the only people that matter. Now, I think it's important to emphasize that in this kind of global comparison, I certainly don't want to claim that all of these nationalisms are the same thing, or the same trend, or the same cause. I mean, quite clearly, from India to Turkey to Russia to China to the US, we have very different conditions, very different causes for political change, very different agendas, and of course, very different political systems in which these discourses are working. So, Marine Le Pen is not the French Trump, even though people lay that claim. Donald Trump is not the American Erdogan. And Nigel Farage, for me, isn't anything, really, but it's different. But what is in common, I would suggest, and we can debate this point, that not only in these nationalist claims to represent, effectively, a segment of the population, in the same discourse, they're actually creating a hierarchy of peoples and population segments, and saying that this group that I'm claiming as the people that I represent are, as Farage and other people have said, more real than the other people. And I think that is, of course, a very dangerous thing for democracy. I think democracy, I'm not a political scientist, but I hope I know enough about democracy. Democracy requires pluralism, and a horizontal pluralism, not a vertical one, not a hierarchical one. So, for me, and my closing words is, I have nothing against a nationalism if it's equated with a patriotism. Of course, you want the best for your country and so forth. But it has to be based on a pluralist notion of the people and not a segmented hierarchical one. And if there's really someone who advocates a pluralist nationalism, I can get behind that, whether I'm voting in the UK or the USA. Thanks a lot.
It's still morning. Good morning. I'm going to look at it, the nationalism question, a little more focused on the U.S. and maybe U.S. foreign policy, kind of where I have more of a comfort zone. And in trying to understand the Trump election, one thing that I've been struck by is how a number of really smart commentators had predicted it. There's a book called The Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. There's a book before that called Coming Apart by Charles Murray, came out I think in 2011, and a more recent book by Robert Putnam, who had previously written Bowling Alone. He wrote a book called Our Kids. And in each of these books, in different ways, with different methodologies and styles, they were getting at this sense that there's a large group of Americans out there who are struggling in some really fundamental ways and who are not really being seen by the political elites. And I think they felt across the board, and these are largely going to be people in middle-sized cities, small towns, a lot of rural areas, who feel as if things aren't working well, and you can cite a lot of those statistics. So, labor force participation rates have come down something like 6 points since the time before the recession. The number of 18 to 34-year-olds living with mom and dad has jumped up something like 4 or 5 percentage points in the last 6-7 years. There's a number of metrics that should have recovered a lot upon the end of the recession. So that was somewhere in June of '09 forward, and they haven't not only not recovered, but they've gotten worse in some instances. So you look at incomes that have stagnated for close to 20 years, student debt, it's harder to get the first job, plus you have to carry this debt load. Consistently, for the last 7-8 years, 65% of Americans writ large, and I would suggest a much higher percentage of this group, have said when asked that America is going in the wrong direction. So yeah, this goes on and on. 5 million fewer manufacturing jobs, the kind of jobs you can do well in without a college degree for the most part. 5 million fewer of those since 2000. So you add that all up, and to me, what that translated into is a growing sense of, almost in an odd way, solidarity among these individuals, these Americans. And they almost, without, I think, formally doing so, they created their own identity group. We have a lot of identity groups in politics. Historically, in my time, Republican politicians have been allergic to trying to play the identity politics card. They just don't like it. They don't want to play race cards or gender cards and all that. And they shy away from it, I think, politically to their detriment in many cases. But what happened, I think, on Election Day is summed up with one, to me, very remarkable statistic, which is Donald Trump won 69% of non-college educated whites. That's not quite where the Democrats are with Hispanics or Asians. It's still way below where they are with African Americans. But that's a lot higher than it had been. I mean, it's 10 or 12 points or so higher than it had been. In certain regions, it would be even higher than that. So like you're talking about a very, very large segment of the American population who have somehow or other found each other, start to see each other as being sharing something mostly negative in common, and saying we have to start behaving in a kind of cohesive political manner. That elitism, populism divide can be summed up by something that I didn't think it got enough attention, but it's still remarkable when you look back on it. When the footage and the recording of Secretary Clinton talking about the basket of deplorables, you talk about a lot of people, a lot of fellow Americans, and that's pretty strong language, if you think about it. If anyone had tried to say another group of Americans was a basket of deplorables, I think there would have been a different explosive reaction in the media and elsewhere. But that was heard, that was heard around the country in these communities, and I think was a rallying cry. I mean, there were actually deplorable, basket of deplorable inaugural balls in Washington in January, So I think that reflected this disdain that some folks had toward these categories of voters, and not thinking there'd be any kind of political counter reaction to it. So just bear all that in mind. I think that's something that, ironically, Bill Clinton really understood well. He came out of that background, if you think about it. He was someone whose upbringing in the community in which he grew up in Arkansas really fits the profile of Trump voters. And apparently he was not, even though he made some comments about it and was making some suggestions toward the end of the campaign, he was not listened to because of the metric people were, plugging numbers in and coming up with different solutions. So that to me is where Trump comes from. And another thing I'll mention is there was a book I read after about 5 people recommended it to me. Walter Russell Mead wrote a book in 2001 called Special Providence by American Foreign Policy Traditions. And he identified 4: Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, Jacksonian, and Wilsonian. And his point, in a way, was that over U.S. history, usually is one dominant of those 4 that is dominant at any given time, but there's always a second one that kind of is coming up and rounding it out. So, Jacksonian, where I think we all say and would understand, especially because he put Jackson's portrait in the Oval Office, is Donald Trump's tradition. And what that essentially comes down to is a strong sense of honor, wanting to have a very robust and strong military. And if anyone threatens the interest of the United States, you use the military, but you don't use it, you don't go out seeking situations. You don't have an evangelical view of the exceptionalism of America that you're trying to impart upon the rest of the world. And both, and the Wilsonian tradition really is that most strongly. Hamiltonian is more using commerce to spread American commercial values, and by definition more than that over time. And the Jeffersonian one is more pacifist in general. And so depending on the presidency, you get mostly 2 of those 4. That Jacksonian approach does comport very easily with a form of nationalism, and I think that's comes out in some of the, I guess it's the alt-right world. And for someone who's been in conservative circles in D.C. for 35 years, I didn't hear about alt-right until well into the election. I had not paid attention to some of the websites, and I didn't realize there was a whole new tradition that had cropped up under my nose. And I'm in think tanks, I'm going to panels, I'm reading books. You think I'd find out about this stuff, right? I hadn't. But you have, Breitbart and some other organs like that, with Steve Bannon as the embodiment, I guess, these days, who reflects that. And that really is to me, a more narrow, focused, look, America first, we're not going to worry about solving anyone else's problems. We're not going to interject ourselves in anyone else's fights, and we're going to withdraw from the world. And we're going to be very suspicious of trading relationships. We're going to be very suspicious of interactions with the rest of the world. And you see that in various forms. Now, the interesting caveat to that, I think, is what happened in the past week or so with the Tomahawk missiles going into that camp, into that base in Syria, is Donald Trump over time going to start to think about the projection of force in a slightly different way, pending the developments, whether it's in the Middle East or in China, North Korea, or elsewhere. You could probably argue that the way they handled that strike was Jacksonian. In other words, it was very limited, kept the runways in place, avoided the Russian personnel who were there, and it was more to send a message that you can't use chemical weapons in this world. That's a red line that we will enforce, and we'll enforce it as we need to. But we're not going to use that as an opportunity to go beyond that and try to accomplish additional, military outcomes. You could argue it that way. You could also argue it that this was a use of force that has gotten quite a bit of approval from places that have been disapproving of things he did, and that maybe that's smelling good, tasting good, let's try it again, and it can be a lesson going forward. Who knows? But events on the ground tend to shape how presidents behave in their conception of the U.S. role in the world, and they may cause them to move in and out of one or another of those four traditions. I think I'll stop there. I'll just mention the last thing is one of the manifestations of all the earlier stuff I talked about. I would really suggest you look at an economist who won the Nobel at Princeton, Angus Deaton, and his wife Ann Case, a couple of years ago wrote a very important study looking at morbidity in different demographic breakouts. And he found, I think it was whites between 45 and 54 had actually, since 1998, between 98 and 2013, had suffered and gone in the wrong direction on mortality. And there was 3 or 4 main reasons. It was suicide, opiate poisoning, liver poisoning, that kind of stuff. And since then, it's been described as the deaths of despair. And they're concentrated in a lot of these communities I talked about earlier. If you read Hillbilly Elegy, you see it come through in a very sad but vivid way. And that tends to be the manifestation of this. And the funny thing is that the folks who get in that situation oftentimes rhetorically are the most self-reliant. We don't want to get anything from government, yet they end up needing government when life, when they OD and they have to hit the ER and they have to go to rehab and so on. It's a really tough dynamic to unpackage. But I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Stephen and Michael. Very good points. As Stephen anticipated, I will have problems with this hand, with the microphone, because I use a lot of hands. Thanks. It's okay. So, before this panel, I was in another panel called Brexit. So, more than return to America, the nationalism is returning to the world, to European Union and to the world in general. My point, the central point of my argument is this. Nothing is eternal. And the nationalism is coming back because there is the erosion of nation state. So I come from Florence in Italy, and for thousands of years, city-states fought against each other. After that, we started to integrate in a higher level of sovereignty. And today, similarly to that time, we are integrating in the globalization with the economy, in the politics with the international institutions, and in our identity. Because the reaction of Brexit, American exceptionalism, American first, is not only an economic issue, is not only a social issue because of migration, is not only a political issue because of international institutions, is also an identity issue. Who I am. I am from Florence, I consider myself Florentine. Then I consider myself from Tuscany, then from Italy, and then from Europe, and then from the planet Earth. Because the other day, they said that we are going to Mars, and we cannot go to Mars unless we go as a species, unless we go collaborating each other, right? So these demagogues, these populists, they are appealing to new, to the returning of the old identities. This happened also between the First and Second World War. When the empire ended, the nation states started to recuperate strength, and they said, now we are going to build a new type of identity. But the nation state had started already in 1648, after 30 years of war, the 30 Years' War. So today, we are in a process in which, without wars, with sovereign national states, like in European Union, with international institutions like International Criminal Court that United States at the beginning entered and then they went out because I am exceptional. I am over the top, and UK the same. I want to be exceptional. There is a reaction of nation states to the natural integration of the world through politics, economic, and societies. So how we deal with that? I want to bring you the identity of countries that are built geographically in a different ways. There are archipelagos of countries like Indonesia that I studied for my comparison with Turkey and the treatment of ethnic minorities. A few days ago we did a panel on that. They have 17,000 islands. There is Philippines also, is an archipelago. Sukarno is the founder of Indonesia. He said, I am a nationalist, but I am from the nationalism of Gandhi. Humankind is my nation. So this pluralistic nationalism that Stephen was talking about earlier, I call it inclusive nationalism, is not incompatible with the internationalism. You can be, as you said, patriotic, and you can be international. But how can you be inclusive in this patriotism? Assimilationism and multiculturalism, the two models of European societies, one in France and one more in Germany and UK, both failed. Because the people that arrive, they don't feel integrated. On one side, they feel excluded in their identity. In the assimilation, you become French, but you cannot have your own style of food, for example, in the public school, because the law is the same for everyone. If you want to eat halal, you cannot. If you want to pray at some time, you cannot. Also, multiculturalism failed, because you maintain your identity, but you are separated each other. So now we have this kind of, sometimes, radicalizations. People feel angry. You know, there is the Age of Anger, Pankaj Mishra, very good book. It's talking about how we are forgetting about the emotions of the people that when the globalization arrives, change your attitude towards your traditional values. You have to be now competitive. But what kind of competition you have if you have so much inequality? You know, we know that 8 people have the majority of the money in the world, and this gap is going to increase more and more. So there is, again, you said America first. True. What does it mean America first? Which America? Because the WASP, we know. But then there is, in 20 years, the white will not be the majority here, the white people. This is a threat to the ontological security of the traditional Jacksonian Americans. I studied also Jacksonian values. If Latinos, Black, Asians will be more than the white, I have to expand my identity towards an inclusive nationalism. Which is my nation? My nation has to become sooner or later the human nation. So we need today to learn from other countries. Another point I want to make is, for example, I am here paying taxes too, but these taxes doesn't go to the pension or to the health insurance. This creates, to some temporary people, the immigrants that are considered in illegal status, a fear of saying, okay, if I integrate, what will be my nation? What I will belong into? You spoke about social capital, right? Social capital, the scholars, they divide in two sides. One is the bridging social capital, the bridging among communities, like Obama was trying to do, right? Not only inside the United States, but among communities around the world. The other is the bonding social capital. Let's close the ranks among our communities, mine, my family, my ethnic group, my religion. But there are other histories around the world that we can learn from. I spoke about Indonesia. I can speak about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, they had for a long time the millet system. Millet in Arabic means nation. The nations at that time were not the ethnic groups. They were the religions. Different identities they had. Then we arrive as European Union and we impose the mono-ethnic nation state, the divide and conquer, that is not adapted to that culture. And today we have a lot of chaos today since 100 years, not only because of economic reasons, oil, anarchic system, international system, but there is also an identity issues that we have to face today. So my point is, nothing is eternal. The nation state is going to change. It has to be, even with the Brexit, it has to accept some sovereign to give back some sovereignty to supranational or even local sovereignties, because the cities are more and more important. The climate change is bringing the sea level rise. There are many cities around the world that are becoming mega cities, urban cities, gigantic, 30, 40 million people. We cannot deal, NATO, UN, even the nation state when it's fragile and failing state cannot deal. Unless you have the local administration that is empowering itself in a new identity, means I belong to Karachi, okay, I want to care about Karachi too, as a city. What does it mean to be citizen in this city? Can I create some civil society organizations like Patran said about Italy that care about my city, and I compare my city with another city in Japan, with Norfolk in Virginia that we have many problems with because of the sea level rise, and let's exchange best practices. So there are layers of identities, layers of sovereignties, and both identity sovereignties has to deal with the future globalization, natural mass movements, and integration economically or politically. So let's not be afraid to have a local identity, but let's not be afraid to have also a more open and inclusive and expanded identity.
The panelists will visit with each other for another couple of minutes apiece. It occurred to me in listening to you, particularly you two guys, are you conflating populism with nationalism a little bit too?
I wouldn't say it's a conflation. There are certain forms of nationalism that rely on populism, but not all forms. And this is one of the points I wanted to get to as well. You know, I was perfectly good with everything Michael was saying, but I think we were talking, and Maurizio as well, but as it were, if this is a useful distinction, there's nationalism in foreign policy and economics. So America's place in the world, its relationship with partners, with potential enemies or things in between. And yeah, the history of politics is an ebb and flow as parties and presidents change between more internationalist, more isolationist. No one's gone totally isolationist, but I think that's been the case, and that's, I think, was part of your point. I was also talking about nationalism within a country, within a nation state, by way of discourses, and that's where the populism comes in. And that's why I'm saying that a lot of these forms of nationalism we're seeing, there are also forms of foreign policy and economic nationalism that all these other countries are doing, but there's also the nationalism in political rhetoric, which I was trying to point out is selective. And you know, it's hugely important what Michael raised about, you know, this statistic of 69% of non-college educated whites, economic despair of a lot of this population segment, poor health, rising mortality. You know, this is a hugely important segment, and whether it becomes an identity group or not might rely on certain discourses, but certainly, and I think, you know, it's without a question that the Democrats didn't do a very good job in addressing this population segment. But then what I'm questioning is turning around and saying that this population segment, which largely voted for the president, becomes the prioritized group, becomes the only real group. Or, you know, if I can sort of paraphrase George Orwell and Animal Farm, you know, some people are more the people than others, is this kind of logic. And that's simply what I'm questioning. Now, it becomes interesting, how do those internal political discourse nationalisms, populist discourses, relate to the foreign policy and the economic ones? And that's outside of my zone, but I don't know, Michael, if you've got thoughts on that.
Well, I think the overlap between the nationalism and the populism has to do with the very concentrated and consistent views of what might be called the elites when it comes to economics and foreign policy, that to this group didn't seem to be working out very well. And they didn't, as you may have noticed, last 15, 20, 25 years, trust in different institutions in America continues to drop. And it's hit lows in many, many of these categories, such as, whether it's Wall Street, banks, insurance companies, whether it's different parts of government, Congress, presidency, and so on, whether it's the media, different categories of the media. It really has diminished. So there's a lot of these discussions take place with the backdrop that those hearing it, and this extends beyond the Trump-type voter, they're not trusting the source. They're immediately questioning the veracity of what they're hearing. And so you have to factor that into how it plays out. And I think, I used a deplorable comment because I think that embodied a broader kind of sense of disdain and the kind of the easy way you can make jokes about flyover America and, some of the, favorite cultural habits of folks who might vote for Trump, whether it's, maybe country music or certain kinds of reality TV shows or whatever. There's a sense that, wow, we're superior, and that's how it comes across. And that gets into that causes a sort of a populist reaction to those perceived slights. And the nationalism front, it's, I think, a sense that America's being taken advantage of just the way they are, and their community's suffering is the manifestation of America being taken advantage of in trade agreements or in other kinds of alliances and interactions with other nations around the world. And I think it's an easy thing to line to cross intellectually if you're in the middle of it.
Yes, populism is probably the most pushing element of nationalism. But from where is coming populism? Here and also in Europe. First of all, it comes from the party crisis. For 100 years, we had mass parties that represented the interest of the people. Then they start to be corrupted in Europe, but also here. Here you have the public funding cutted when you want the private funds. You have to choose. I think both Obama and Trump and everyone in the last 3 or 4 elections, they choose the private funds. Yes, McCain took the public. I was working in the Carter Center. We were comparing the Latin American countries, and the passage from public to private fund was creating a lot of corruption. So our solution was to think about both public and private. A little bit of public, obviously controlled. Otherwise, if you have public funds, like in Italy, it becomes only public. It becomes a disaster if you don't have a control. But this type of reforms to improve the party system, to make it the anti-establishment reduce, because the people will feel more participating, will feel more that not only who has the money can influence the government. I, with the civil society organization, can influence the government. We have the 5-star movement in Italy coming from the civil society organizations. Why? Because they said enough with these parties. But if you throw the baby with the wet water, the parties are very important. You cannot throw them. Otherwise, we go towards the strong man. We go again back to the authoritarianism. But the parties have to be reformed. And the other thing is the polarization. In the past, to be at the center was very good. We had the Christian Democrat in Italy for 50 years. They maintained stability, but the problem is that the government didn't last more than 1 year because the power sharing and the constitutional democracy of parties together was weakening the government, because every time the small party go away, you had to go back to elections. But the polarization is neither very good. And this we go to the social media and the technological revolution, the filter bubble, the multiplicator effect. The polarized democracies, they create the narrative of us versus them. Here, the party, a Republican has the Tea Party going into the stream, and the other party also going to the stream. This is not very good for democracy and also for nationalism, because it's creating, I am more nationalist than you. So, party crisis and polarization are the elements that create populism. And populism, it's strong today because another problem is the leaders. The leaders today don't lead masses, they reflect them. I write in my blog sometimes these articles about the leaders in the European Union. Many times, instead of inspiring, instead of giving charismatic pathos, you know, Aristotle talked about logos to convince the masses, that the language, then you need the ethos, that is the moral values, the rules, but then you need also the pathos. These leaders, they are not able to have long visionary policies, imagination for the future. And this is another problem. So many times they reflect the masses. We are going lower level with the leaders. They are very ignorant many times. Look at Berlusconi. We anticipated Trump for 20 years. And this is another problem that creating more and more the idea of I represent the masses, but in reality, I'm not representing the masses. I'm representing some interests, specific interests, and I manipulated the discourse to convince the masses to vote me, while in reality, I'm asking to vote for my people, my groups, and not in reality for the masses.
Okay, we're going to do questions. Students have preference. Students, when you are responding using the app, put the word student at the beginning so we'll be able to recognize you. Those who do not have the app can do cards. Delmar, are you around? I can't. Is there somebody handing out cards? Can you see them? Can you? Well, okay. Absent the cards, if the mics are on, then we will use the mics. We'll give preference to students. So students, you can line up first. We have a couple of questions that are already in, and from a student. Do you believe that the more recent divisions and factions forming within the Republican Party is a result of this return of nationalism, or is it simply the result of increased polarization?
I guess that's my question, right? I think the divisions you see are a function of increasing almost universal frustration on the side of Republicans that the things that our government does have not been working out very well, and that we need to try something different. In some cases, it's sending it down to the states. In other cases, it's just stopping the activity. In other cases, it's reforming it. And that there's a kind of all these veto points in the legislative process that prevent these reform ideas from ever getting beyond the first or second stage of the legislative dance. And what you're seeing is not so much, and I'll caveat this in a second, not so much a difference over substance and desired outcome, it's a tactical difference. So that the Freedom Caucus in the House has a whole different way of wanting to engage. But there are some places where there's a substantive difference emerging, and this is where that alt-right dynamic comes in. So that I think on immigration, for example, you can be 100% enthusiastic about immigration at current levels, but be frustrated by the wholesale ignoring of the law, and that there's a problem with that. And there's a rule of law element to how you want to handle immigration reform. But there's an emerging group that just thinks there's too many immigrants coming in, period. So if we brought in 1,050,000 in 2015, that's several hundred thousand too high, and that we need, it's a broader and different kind of concern, and that really splits Republicans. If you want to see Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, members like that, senators like that, like Toomey and others, get frustrated, it's when that divide comes up. They want to reform the system, they don't want to reduce the overall flow in any measurable amount. So yeah, there's some dynamic like that, but for the most part, on a day-to-day basis, it's, you know, do you try to get everything you want to get in one fell swoop, or do you take a gradual, more incremental approach to policy making?
I'm on thin ice here because I don't know much about the Republican Party, and especially as an expat looking back. But I mean, just one thought that occurs, though, by way of response to the question is, of course, divisions within the Republican Party certainly predate Trump and the previous election. I mean, Tea Party came along some time ago, even during the era of Cheney-Rumsfeld. I know that there was quite a bit of division on the right things to do and so forth. And I would think that normally, or let's say in normal times, that's always a good thing within a party to have real debates. And you know, I'm sure right now amongst the Democrats, there's certainly real debates about, well, obviously still a lot of post-mortem going on, what went wrong, but about the right ways forward and so forth. So, yeah, I think there are longer-term trends, but yeah, I really don't know. And again, I would have to defer to Michael on this. Is there something different from those longer-term trends, Tea Party, et cetera, that have more divided things? But I just have to say that, you know, I've got an older brother who's you know, quite a long-term Republican, and he was basically telling me that he doesn't recognize his Republican Party anymore. And I think that's an issue for a lot. I mean, you probably come across it all the time.
Yeah, again, I think the polarization is created also by the fact that this filter bubble of the information. So we read only my newspaper, only my social media. The public sphere that Habermas spoke about, it was the moderate space where we can compare our vision and we can create agreements. So reduce the polarization. But the public sphere is more and more or less today also because of the post-fact, post-truth. Everyone, instead of basing on facts, can express an opinion, and then that opinion tend to be extreme because it has to be different from the other side. So I think, you know, Machiavelli, he wrote the book, The Prince, not to support authoritarianism, but to show how authoritarianism can be born. And it can be born, besides the inequality, from the extreme partisanship. And extreme partisanship is not good for democracy. Here you have a two-party system. And two-party system is good because the alternative of democracy is good, alternance among power. But it's also good to have extra parties that moderate the space and recreate that public sphere that is needed for moderation and democracy, and also reduction of these authoritarian tendencies.
You can actually argue on that point that the Freedom Caucus in the House is essentially its own party. They're very independent of the House leadership and the party leadership. Many of them got elected by circumventing the normal routes to power. They circumvented county parties, they circumvented the donor class that had been in place in certain communities for a long time on the Republican side, and they emerged one day with a website and a lot of small donors and attention on some, you know, websites that a lot of people in the district read, and they're become a viable political force without ever having played the game. And so they feel as if the establishment, capital E, is their enemy, whether it's a Republican one or a Democratic one or a media one or fill in the blank. So that's one point. The other point I just would raise is I think you see more divisions in the parties when they're actually in control and they have to deliver on something in the eyes of their base. So there was a reason why the Affordable Care Act in the Senate was finalized in Harry Reid's office on Christmas Eve, 2009. That wasn't the plan, okay? It was because there were factions and there were debates and there were members holding out for, Nebraska needed something and Louisiana needed a fix and Memphis, Tennessee needed a hospital fix, and all these things were being negotiated out toward the final days. It was very raucous, you know, and in the House, Bart Stupak and pro-life Democrats were demanding certain assurances that they wanted in the bill on relating to abortion. So that was, you know, a function of them being in control of the whole process. Republicans were most united when they had someone like Obama in the White House, because you know what you were against. Your first 3 paragraphs of your press release could be uniform across the whole party. But the problem and the tension and the raucousness arises when you're now saying, okay, now what? And that's what you saw recently on the healthcare front, that it's always been a dirty little secret that on the right, the conservative healthcare experts have never quite agreed about what the final solution should look like for markets versus tax credits versus tax deductions versus healthcare savings accounts and all that. They always disagreed about that. They agreed on what they didn't like, you know, and now you're seeing it come out in full flower, and it looks really, really bad, but it's always kind of been there lurking underneath, but you never needed to really address it.
This is from a student. Can nationalism in the United States truly be nationalism because the United States is so diverse and doesn't share a common ethnicity, language, or culture? Is it not more patriotism?
I'll take a stab at that. Well, you know, I'm going to do the typical academic thing. It's down to definitions, depends what you mean, all that sort of stuff. Because, you know, there's a lot of thinking around ethno-nationalism, which is exactly, I think, what the student is inferring from nationalism. But there are other forms of nationalism which are based on things like constitutions, and common histories, and heritage, and so forth. So I wouldn't want to say that nationalism is always ethno-nationalism. And again, I think we're talking about different levels, you know, sort of what we started off with. I was talking about kind of internal definitions of who the people are and what is the national populace, as opposed to the place of the nation in the world system, in the world economy, and so forth. Those are also different. And sometimes ethno-nationalisms are involved in that game as well. But I think what I'm calling for, by way of this kind of pluralist nationalism, is in the face of or against ideas of single ethno-nationalism. I mean, so for instance, you know, Turkey, Erdogan, is particularly an ethno-nationalism, but the nationalism of Modi in India is a religious nationalism. So again, you know, typical academic things, depends what you mean, and so forth.
Just let me add that the people I talked about earlier, the conservatives who like to embrace immigration, would be the first ones to say that the whole premise of that, you know, to make it work requires a certain level of assimilation into the core values. And I forget who it was that said the biggest factor about America is that America was founded on a creed, which means that you can join it, you can become a member no matter what your ethnicity, no matter what your origins, no matter where you're coming from, if you say, I believe in this stuff and I want to become an American, and being an American means something different than being a German or a Brit or someone from France or whatever, right? And it's hard to imagine me going to many, many countries and suddenly being over time accepted as a card-carrying Egyptian or something, right? There's a different notion of that. And I think in America, that's the point that is at issue in many ways right now. And what does it mean to be an American? And there's some people that want to create all these different walls between ethnic and religious and racial groups that is anathema to a lot of us who think, let's find out what the core founding principles of the country are, and ask the people who are coming in, you know, buy into this. And it may manifest itself politically in all kinds of different ways, but if you're buying into the core principles, you're an American. And then we can have our fun debates and discussions on panels and over dinner tables and all that kind of thing.
Correct. And I think here the motto, you know, which is E pluribus unum, from anyone. The motto in Europe is In varietate concordia. Again, Latin means united in diversity. So before I am Italian, my ethnicity, my nation, and then I am European. Here, before you are American, the creed, the idea, and then you see if you are different ethnicity, etc. So in this case, I think it's like a state in search of a nation, like France was like that. Italy, Germany, Turkey are nations in search of a state. We come with the state after having our history of nation. And you know, when you have this name of, for example, Italians, Italy, Turkish, Turkey, we tend to have this ethno-nationalism, ethno-democracies we can define sometimes. And this can be more dangerous because it's, again, quite exclusive. Instead of here, it should be more inclusive, but elites can use the narrative of division for their own power. So we have to study how institutions and elites that are in power inside the institutions can create a divide and conquer, divide and rule, how do you say, divide and impera, yes, divide and conquer for the political or economic power.
Just if I could have a follow-up, you know, personal example, if you forgive that again. You know, as I said, I've got UK citizenship and American citizenship. And I feel okay about taking out that UK citizenship because I participate in the politics, I buy into parliamentary democracy, I pay my taxes and so forth. I'd never call myself British. I would just sound stupid with my Chicago accent and so forth. And there are certainly a lot of English nationalists who would even contest me taking out UK citizenship. But I think, you know, that's in line with what's being said, though, that for people who come and buy into the system, you can be part of the nation, but not part of a presumed ethno-nation.
A wildly simplistic response to that would be that there are hugely diverse people who gather together to root for the same football team. This is an interesting one. Do you believe that nationalism paves the way to fascism? Or what is the interrelationship between fascism and nationalism?
It doesn't have to, but I think there's a lot of instances in history where it has. I mean, look at the way ethno-nationalism, I guess, is a term I'm learning here today. Thank you very much. Hitler did it, Stalin did it, Putin's doing it now. You identify an ethnic cluster of people, whether they're Russian, German, or you know, whatever, and if they're living outside your borders, that becomes the de facto excuse to protect their interests because the ethnic similarities trump, so to speak, the different being in different countries. And if you have an interest as a Russian in Moscow to help the Russians in Ukraine or the Russians in Crimea, so therefore that legitimizes an excursion, an incursion, an invasion into that area. But I think the remedy for that is to resist the temptation to see nationalism and ethnic lineage as being indelible and the same. I think that's the beauty of the American experiment. Is that it's okay to be an American from any conceivable starting point. I actually am at the point where I'm surprised sometimes when I meet somebody and they have a quote-unquote American accent. I mean, you know, it's remarkable, at least in cities like New York or DC where I spend most of my time. And I never quite think about that as being, oh, you can't be an American. This seems to be absolutely automatic to me. But.
Yes, Plato in Greek times, he said that after democracy, we have oligarchy. After oligarchy, we have democracy, and after democracy, we go back to tyranny. Because democracy creates a lot of divisions. Sometimes you have to change constantly. You know, here in globalized times, to have a democracy is a problem because you have to go to the parliament and ask for permissions to do policies. That's why many democracies are in crisis and are going towards authoritarianism today. But it's not a direct relation, as you said correctly, Michael, because can facilitate authoritarianism or fascism, nationalism. But it's not necessarily that direction because we need anyway strong policies, fast policies in globalized times. And sometimes you need strong executive power. That's why in Italy we did a referendum to cut one of the two chambers. We failed because the people felt, okay, we are risking to go back to Mussolini. So how we pass the understanding that we need strong governments, but with the check and balances like you have here, I think is one of the few presidential systems that didn't have coups military coups because of how well you are organized. So the presidential system that they want to build in Turkey is dangerous for that, because in cases where you don't have clear check and balances, too much strong nationalist and executive power can go towards authoritarianism or fascism. But here, I don't think it is a problem.
If I can just try to put it in a sort of mini formula or something, I would say that most forms of fascism that we know, as you were saying, rely on a particular ethno-nationalism, but as I think we're all saying, nationalism needn't be ethno-nationalism, and even ethno-nationalism needn't end up as fascism. There are plenty, across Europe, there are plenty of ethno-nationalist parties, Danish People's Party, the Finnish True Finns, and all these, but I wouldn't say that they're necessarily fascist in their political agenda, but they are ethno-nationalist in their political agenda.
Question for Mike. Mike, it's fine to insist that immigrants buy into our core values, but doesn't that presuppose that we as a nation will respect those core values with respect to our immigrants? To our immigrants.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. It's fine to insist that immigrants buy into our core values, but doesn't that presuppose that we as a nation will respect those core values with respect to our immigrants?
Well, maybe to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it all depends how you define core values, right? What I think they're getting at is, maybe different traditions an immigrant group would adhere to. But if an immigrant group comes in and wants to behave in a way that is, very, very challenging to our notion of equality under the law, is that a problem for us? Okay, do we want to, in Europe, some communities have sort of been no-go zones where certain standards of whether it's, family structure, behavior toward, way to enforce family strictures and so on can violate all the criminal codes in that country, but do you really want to go in and cause a ruckus, right? I think those no-go zones have been documented a lot in different publications. That's the notion here. If America believes in, as part of our core, principles, is the equality under the law and consent of the governed and so on, I think those are the things I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, the style of, maybe a preference for a certain kind of educational structure or a certain, voting preference for a type of government program, or the derivative things that come from trying to apply those values in everyday life. That's a much different thing, and you do want to respect that, but you want everyone to play by those same rules. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and if I recall it and get the gist of it right, I would completely agree with it, i.e., it's expected that immigrants come in and adopt core values, fairness, equality, anti-discrimination, all these sorts of things, and then, shouldn't they expect that they are treated with the same core values? And as we know, that often doesn't happen, and that's the difference between core values as principles and core values as practices. And so I think that's why it's important to have a public sphere and a media and NGOs and so forth to call out and remind us anytime that we are not acting in accordance with core values that, yes, indeed, we are asking others to adopt as they come.
Yeah, I agree. And there is Kim Lee in Canada. He's speaking about cultural rights and communal rights. These communal rights, they are not necessarily incompatible with individual rights. So we can obviously respect the law of the nation, of the state, but to give possibility to different traditions, creatively, we can create a new type of norms, give possibility to different traditions, different communities to have their own style of life, either food or the spiritual life. Doesn't mean that you have to change the nation-state laws. You just include, in a way or in another, in the norms, the possibility of having not opposite laws, but possibilities, as I said, if you want to pray at certain times, maybe we can do it, and this doesn't mean that we had to change the common national norms. Yeah.
Would it not be true, however, that every immigrant group, upon arriving on these shores, are confronted with that same problem over time? That it takes time for the nation to accept these people and treat them as they ask to be treated?
I think that's the history of immigration in a nutshell in this whole country. Just look at the depictions by Thomas Nast when he was taking down the Tweed Ring in New York City of the Irish. They were simians. They were apes in his depiction, because that's how he felt about the Irish. And you know, my parents got married to great controversy, which will surprise many students today who, you know, deal with all these diversity issues. An Irish-born immigrant marrying a Czech son of immigrants, that was viewed as like almost like two racial groups intermingling. I mean, that was very controversial from at least my dad's side. And today, you don't think of that as Czechs and Irish being that much different, you know. But there were times when the distinctions were being made from one European group to another, and there were textbooks written at the time, you know, that were talking about all the different races, like 6 races of Europe, and they were talking about the different features and so on, really dividing people up according to that. And happily, 100 years later, those distinctions are all but forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, as Michael said, and as I say, our research institute looks at this globally, the process of immigration, and it is almost a kind of rule that every wave and so forth faces problems, and that's the strange thing, faces problems from the previous waves of immigrants, and does take time. Or, I mean, you know, I think Jon Stewart, you know, put it the best. He said, every wave or generation of immigrants reserves the right to shit on the next generation or wave of immigrants.
From a student, based on your comments about American diversity, are the interests of nationalist groups always entrenched in racism, or are there national parties that simply prioritize their country's citizens, not individual races? Is that nationalism? Okay, I'm going to try it again. I'm not sure I understand the question. Based on your comments about American diversity, are the interests of nationalist groups always entrenched in racism, or are there nationalist parties that simply prioritize their country's citizens, not individual races?
We have a lot of groups in America that have been around for a while that are focused on race. So La Raza is the race, right? NAACP and groups like that have focused on African Americans. There have been different groups for different ethnics, white ethnic groups that have formed over time. And to this day, go on Capitol Hill, they are advancing the perceived interest of those groups as if everybody of that, within that category, has a shared common interest just because of their race, not even if they might personally disagree. They speak on behalf of Hispanics or African Americans or what have you. And is that racial? Yeah, it's racialism. Is it racist? It doesn't have to be, but it could be.
Okay. Bernie and Trump supporters had a lot in common. So the question is there an opportunity to have them join in a national endeavor, or are the differences too separate?
This is a great question. One of my theories is that whether he is aware of it or not, Trump is going to make a play for the trade sector, the trade union, private sector side of the AFL-CIO. He's had the presidents of those unions come in. He's going to be pushing things like infrastructure bills, and he'll be happy to give them a lot of different, regulatory love in what they do in the Department of Labor and elsewhere. His trade policies are singing a beautiful song to these unions. And that's the kind of the beginning of this potential realignment. And I think that the common between Bernie's people and his people might be a little bit too much to overcome, except that I think the Venn diagrams overlap. They certainly overlap on temperament. There was this, I think, very commonly felt sense that both those groups of voters had it with the status quo. They talked about the establishment with capital E in the same kind of disdainful, frustrated, angry way. So if you can find a way to fuse that into some kind of common political movement, you'd have to do it with a great, at the rank and file level, a great diversity of thought about how to deal with that anger, how to deal with that disdain and resentment. Because I think the two groups would look at the role of government in different ways, look at the faith in coming in and micromanaging some aspect of a person's life. And one side of it would say, yeah, you can do it, here's how you do it. Other side would say, no way, Jose. And so you'd have certain aspects of that merger that wouldn't work out, but it's certainly something that's not going to go away in the body politic. And I think I would look at that trade union issue as a potential way to move a block of previously democratic votes and resources from one column to the other, and just see how that plays out.
Again, on thin ice here because, certainly a lot more people know more about Bernie than I do, but I would think that, yeah, Bernie would find it a lot harder to get in bed with Trump than Trump with Bernie. Well, okay, maybe not the right metaphor, but you know what I mean. Because, I think it's very interesting about things like infrastructure projects, and certainly that 69% of the non-college educated whites and catering to their difficulties and needs and so forth is a common agenda. But from what I understand of Bernie's agenda, it was a lot about the 1% and Wall Street and so forth as well, and that's why I just can't see him going that way. But that's just my take from afar.
Maybe one difference could be the new generations. Because I think the new generations, the youth that voted for Bernie and the youth that voted for Trump, they were different. One, they were more cosmopolitans, and one, they were more patriotic, I think. We should study that. But this, for me, is a positive element, because if the new generations are looking to travel abroad, interested in different cultures, to the migrants that come here, this means for the future we can be optimists. So this was, I think, one difference. And these millennials, also in Europe, are pushing, surprisingly, because they didn't live the World War II, but for more integration. Not so much surprising, because they speak languages, they studied abroad, and this is the new generations, I think, will be the ones that will fight against this resurgence of nationalism. Because also in Brexit, mostly of the old generations voted, or at least rural people, the most isolated, obviously. And usually the old elders are the most isolated because, okay, they can travel for tourism, but they don't go abroad to work or live or study. So I think this is an important element.
Okay, do we really have core values? We don't agree about LGBT rights or rights for women, for example, and neither do some of our immigrants. Which side are they supposed to be on in America?
Well, in this case, that's the derivative of the core values and how you interpret it, how you want to see that value or values become a reality in our society. And there's always going to be big differences about that kind of implementation phase. It's the core value that if someone's going to contest the notion of equality under the law, you've got a different problem than if you interpret equality under the law in slightly different ways, but you accept the premise. That's my point. It's sort of like phase one versus phase two or something. It's a top of the pyramid versus the bottom of the pyramid in terms of implementation.
Okay, that brings to mind another question. With all of the diversity that we have in this country, what would be an overarching theme that could unite this country today in a nationalistic fervor? Yeah, what could a politician, a candidate for president, offer that might cross all of the various barriers of diversity that we have today? What would be a unifying theme in today's America?
I think, as he said, go back to the creed and the foundation fathers and the light on the hill. So it means to live up to the values, both internationally and locally. This means that if the refugees need help, this is the place that should be the first to help. I mean, not only because of the foreign policy actions or the economic wealth, but also because of the values. And NATO has been founded to defend democratic values. And so if we go back to that core values and appeal with leaders that should appeal to that, but unfortunately, as I said, leaders sometimes they mirror the emotional anger without proposing future tolerant visions. The leaders should go back to those core values, and then you can sell the idea of inclusive nationalism.
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't suggest any major solution. I mean, even any kind of economic policies and measures are always going to be quite selective in who they affect. So more on a kind of broad, I mean, certain kind of symbolic levels are important. And I would think that one message that would stand out is possibly something along the lines that to guarantee that all voices will be heard. I think this was a problem in the last election. Some saying that the white working class voice wasn't being heard, or in other elections past, certain ethnic minorities not being heard and so forth. So if there was some way of getting to that, we are listening, we will hear you. Now, of course, what politicians, how they'll run with that is another thing. But I think right now, in many places, we are in a position where a lot of voices are simply being stifled or drowned out. And that is bad for democracy itself, too.
This is transnational. Do you believe there will ever be a global government system superseding the national system? And if so, would you speculate on what the circumstances might be that would bring it about?
I'll probably even want to defer to Maurizio on this because you know more about it. But I mean, some sort of framework may emerge in some kind of semi-science fiction future. But I mean, already, you could say that the EU is an experiment in this, in the mini, and there are so many problems in just keeping 28 countries together. And what emerges and what's being called for more and more are structures that are really kind of multi-tiered, and each tier is responsible or has a certain type of policy prominence. And I mean, the UN is certainly not a global governance, but it is a kind of tier, at least for conversation and policies, often in terms of conventions that some people sign up to or not. So, yeah, I would say, maybe I'm too idealistic and kind of believe in a Star Trek future or something like that. But certain frameworks will emerge. I wouldn't call them exactly governance. They might resemble something more like the EU. That is, groups agreeing on certain levels, on certain issues. There will be common policy, and on others, we'll do it our own way.
Yes, tomorrow afternoon we have a panel on a U.S. retreat from international alliances and the end of liberal order. We have already form of global and world governments with the international treaties. We created the Arms Trade Treaty, chemical weapons. We have international institutions like Criminal Court, International Criminal Court, but obviously there is a reaction of the sovereign state and saying, I want to be by myself. Now, the idea is that we need, in this phase of transition internationally, to include the rest. Okay, we are in a crisis we are in the post-Western world. We define that in the academic, environment, that the liberal order is eroded because of this exceptionalism, UK, US, and because of the growing of the rest. How we converge. There is a very good book, Mahbubani from Singapore. He's from Indian origins. He's talking about the global convergence. How we include the rest. First of all, with reforms, because United Nations Security Council is obviously after the Second World War, but today we have the BRICS. How we include the rest in the global governance. And I think if we, as European Union, not only will stick around together, but we also try to do socialization with the least socialized states. Let's think about North Korea. It's not only cost and benefit and rational thinking when we go to the rivals. We have to understand that the mistrust is created by the isolation. And unless we start to socialize, it's very difficult to create world governments. So I think, again, there is the need of international institutions, but there is also the need of nation state to socialize with the rest. Nation state from the West to socialize with the rest.
In a nutshell, I'll just say Francis Fukuyama wrote a book 25 years ago after the Cold War ended and the wall came down, The End of History. A couple of years after that, Samuel Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. Fukuyama thought we might have the predicate to get where that question was asking if we'd ever get. Huntington said no, but one thing that could pull us all together would be an alien invasion.
Exactly.
Thank you. Panel, it was wonderful. Thank you, audience. And please remember, when you're allocating funds this year for charities, please keep in mind that you love this CWA and put us on your card. Thank you.